end, actually. I mean, without your contribution, the album wouldn't have been released, and also I wouldn't be able to send, a viable recording of Pandora that you recorded for me a few weeks ago. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a big difference just being able to have examples of your work because obviously when it's just on the page, you can only really imagine it. And even with Sibelius, it doesn't really do a good job of showing you what the music's like. So
no,
yeah, I think that's another thing we can maybe cover. But so yeah, so as I say, it's going to be quite loose. I've got a few generic questions or talking points. We'll just sort of work our way through really, and anything that comes to mind that you think is useful, throw out there.
yeah, sure.
And I'll just start off with a little intro now, just for the sort of edit. Okay, everyone, thanks for tuning in. We're delighted to be joined here by Freddy Naftel, or his official title, Frederick Naftel, UK-based composer that we've been fortunate enough to work with a few times in some different recording projects, string quartets, chamber strings and things like that. So Freddy, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. In fact, you've caught me just at the sort of start of what I hope will be a very busy year, music-wise, composition-wise.
Amazing. So when you say a busy year, is this lots of different things, or just for writing and being creative?
Well, funny enough, I started off the year well with performance of a new revised version of my ballet Pandora by the Slaithwaite Philharmonic in Huddersfield under Ben Ellin, which was the best performance I've heard of the piece, and it's also an extended version. And I was glad to have a recording of it, which has really helped me understand really how I am writing for the orchestra, having composed for goodness knows over 40 years or more. I'd left orchestral music behind me for a long time, concentrating on smaller projects, and when the opportunity came about 7 years ago, when I was living in Manchester and playing with the Bolton Symphony, and they commissioned me to write a piece of music for them, I produced Pandora, the Legend of Pandora, and I felt that, I'd acquired sort of, new skills regarding writing for the orchestra. I think it helps, for one thing, being a performing musician. I'm a percussionist, that you are within an orchestra, you can hear all the sounds around you, you can hear what works, what doesn't work, the different blending of sounds, and that has helped. But for this year's performance, the orchestra were putting on a concert which included Hall's Planets, and they said you're very welcome to expand your piece and add extra instruments if you wish, since we've got the setup for the planets. So yes, I took advantage of that, and it's certainly the biggest orchestra I've ever written for, and I have to say, well, personally I was pleased with the results, and everything seemed to flow and the orchestra were happy. So this has led me to a number of projects which I'm planning this year. I'm planning at least 2 orchestral works, including a symphony and also a short orchestral piece. And also I'm working with the Slaithwaite Orchestra on a recording of a full album of my orchestral music. So that's something we're working to put together at the moment. And because the orchestra is sort of semi-professional, amateur semi-professional, we have to find a time suitable for those people who of course are working during the week. But it's an exciting project, and it's one of a number of things I've got going on this year, so yes, I'm going to be very busy.
Yeah, no, that all sounds great. So yeah, lots of exciting things on the horizon there. So just for the listeners or people tuning in, I was lucky enough to be at that concert, and yeah, it was an amazing performance. I really enjoyed the pre-concert talk as well. Some of the things you were talking about like the creative process, I suppose, of writing for different, I guess, different themes, like the sort of backstory behind the piece. So we'll come to all of that in a bit. But yes, we talked a bit about the future there. It'd be nice to start off with, let's go in the opposite direction. Let's wind back time, I guess, all the way to I guess, your entry point into music and sort of your backstory on, because you mentioned about playing as a percussionist, how you got into that, and then I guess how you got into writing your own music as well.
Well, there's a funny story behind that. I mean, I started playing when I was at school, but I came to music late. I mean, 14 years old.
Yeah.
It's actually quite a late stage. I had no interest in music other than pop music before then. And then I had the most extraordinary music teacher when I talk in those days. It were O levels, and my music teacher from then on was so inspiring. It's just one of those things where you're lucky enough to have a good teacher who introduced you to all kinds. The reason I chose percussion, although I did learn piano as well, and I took all the exams, is that with percussion there's such a variety, particularly within the orchestra. I was never interested in drumming. That side of it never appealed to me, although I suppose at one stage I did wish I was gifted enough to play the drums in jazz or rock. But I think the lure of all these fascinating instruments that made these unusual sounds was too much for me. And my initial reason was, I thought you don't have to be able to read music to play percussion. The conductor just indicates a sign for you to play the gong or the timps or whatever. I soon found out that wasn't the case, and you have to be a very good counter. And I ended up being probably the best counter in subsequent orchestras. I joined music centre orchestras, the Manchester Youth Orchestra, etc. People are asking me, "Oh, I've lost my place. Where are we?" Also, I seemed to find that I took to percussion naturally, even more so than the piano, and I was a pretty good sight reader. And also, I ended up with all the whenever there was a tuned percussion part, no one else wanted to do it, so I ended up playing the xylophone, glock, whatever was needed.
Yeah.
And it just seemed the natural thing, and I enjoyed it so much. So then I joined a number of orchestras there, local orchestras that were really pretty good, as well as, of course, attending concerts given by, in Manchester, the Halle, BBC Phil, Camerata, and other ensembles. But a composition, that was something I just fell into, and I have to say I was no prodigy, not at all. My first compositions were rubbish, to tell you the truth, and I did have a composition teacher during my last 2 years at school in my sixth form. Unfortunately, I think we had 3 or 4 lessons together, none of which were of any use, except something he told me, which I've never forgotten. He says, always begin and end your pieces well. Begin them well, and then you've got the audience. So I took that tip. Everything I did was self-taught. I listened to music, I took scores from the music library, I followed music, and then playing within orchestras I got to experience firsthand pieces I'd never have dreamt of playing before or even listening to, and that led me to a kind of thirst for knowledge regarding music, which is why, after working for a music publisher for a number of years, I decided to become a teacher. I ended up as a music teacher, which took up 25 years or more of my life, and my passion was really instilling the enthusiasm that I'd experienced to the students as well. And then my writing music, I got to know a number of people, certainly from university time onwards. The more people I knew, I found I was writing for unusual combination. I think one of the first pieces I wrote at university was a piece for double bass and harpsichord. So those are fantastic opportunities.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great. So there's a few things I kind of wanted to pick up on there. But yeah, you talked about the role of, I guess, an inspiring or a good teacher who's able to, sort of really draw you into the world of a subject and make it interesting. And then I thought it's sort of that full circle of thing then, I guess. Have you then ended up becoming a music teacher yourself? Just wondering if there was any sort of mental link for yourself in that, of maybe thinking of Given a young person a similar sort of experience that you'd had?
Well, I don't know. I've always been interested in educating young people, and the thing with music is, I think the hardest thing was when they got to GCSE and A level, and they came to the composition part of the course, which is 30%, and I said right away, the one thing I'm not going to do is tell them how to compose. I mean, if they've got a style already, and this was well before the advent of music software like Sibelius, even Cubase, which is the one I began with. But then when we moved on to Sibelius, there was many more opportunities for students to, basically things were written for them, and I heard some remarkable stuff from these young people, and I said, right, well, all I can do is suggest what you can add or take away from it, but whatever you do, don't change the style of it. It's fine. You have a natural, you don't want to discourage, but at the same time, you don't want to make young people think that what they're writing is the bee's knees. I mean, even now, after 40 odd years of composing, I'm always self-critical. But the thing is, I very rarely, this is probably another issue, I very rarely go back to a piece and improve it, because it stands or falls. Although with the case of the ballet Pandora, yes, I did go back, and I'm still going to go back to that piece to add more movements and turn it into a full-length ballet, because that's a piece of which I'm especially proud right now. That's one of the pieces that I still feel needs some more work.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So you mentioned a bit about taking a kind of self-taught approach. I'm just wondering what that was like back in those days. Obviously, we didn't have the ease of access that we probably did now. I'm just wondering what that was like. So I was actually in the the music section of the Central Library the other day, and I was thinking, this would have been an amazing resource to have access to pre-internet and all those things. So what can you tell me maybe about that sort of
That's
thing?
what I mean. Weekend, Saturday sometimes in the afternoons and during the school holidays, I would probably spend half a day in the library looking through scores, just looking generally through them, and then by then I was, I had my sort of favourite composers, and as a young person I took very readily to the music of Shostakovich. In fact, our music teacher took us to a concert of which included a Shostakovich symphony. I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever heard. I immediately bought a recording. I thought, how does this guy write for orchestra? How does he achieve that sound? And most of all, how does he sustain a climax for minutes and minutes and minutes without even a let-up? This is a composer who's fully aware and is literally wearing his heart on his sleeve, sarcastically in many places as well. And then I got to look the pieces we were playing within the youth orchestra, such as I got to play music by Elgar. Malcolm Arnold became a favourite composer. I thought he was just wonderful. And funny enough, I was lucky to meet him on 3 occasions. So Malcolm Arnold's always been an influence. Vaughan Williams probably is my favourite composer of all. And there's a couple of pieces of mine that I think show that influence quite clearly, the Aubard Pastoral and the Folk Song Suite. But I think the trouble is nowadays with composers is there are a lot of composers, male, female, all persuasions, all styles, all idioms. Some of them reach a particular point in their life where they have created a certain style and they stick with it. They will not compromise. That's fair enough. Me, I don't. I'm happy to write in whatever style is suitable for that occasion, whatever idiom, whatever instruments are available, and if it's a tonal piece, if it's a melodic piece, fine. If it's more, acerbic and dissonant, yes, I can do that. But I think even in my most dissonant pieces of music, there's always a desire to communicate. I think the impetus here is that many years ago I attended a composers conference at the Royal Northern College of Music. I was invited to it, and I sat on a panel with a number of composers and educationalists and music inspectors, and they were talking about the complete lack of modern music suitable for young people, engaging them, accessible to listen to, good to play, enjoyable. And they were saying that composers need to be less selfish and think more about who they're writing for. And I remember at that weekend, one of the staff at the College of Music was saying that we've commissioned a number of pieces for concert band from composers, you know, familiar and unfamiliar, and he said though they wrote wonderful pieces, all of them failed in the one simple task of making it suitable for whatever standard those instrumentalists had reached. And I remember one composer said quite openly, I never ever think of my audience. And on the other hand, also at that conference, I mentioned his name, sadly he's no longer with us, David Bedford, who again is a composer who writes in so many, I mean he's worked with Mike Oldfield, he's written the arrangements for a lot of pop songs as well. And he was saying that, you know, it's very important. He's written music that is unbelievably avant-garde, but at the same time he's written some wonderful tuneful stuff as well. I decided, that's the way forward. And whenever I tried a piece out, obviously young people can be very cynical and very direct, and they'll say, what's this rubbish we've got to play? And then they'll play it and they say, no, it's not bad. So I learned, you know, what works, what doesn't work. And then when I got to play in local orchestras, I think the first one was Stockport Symphony, who were very, very good. And after a few years of playing with them, I wrote them a short overture, which they played on a play day. And, you know, everyone said, well, yeah, let's perform this, let's put it in concert. And it took off from there. Funny enough, Jack, that piece, which was called a fanfare overture, lasted 3 minutes and was just 3 minutes of touching the whole orchestra, became the basis for the festival movement of Pandora.
Oh, really interesting.
That was twice as long as the overture. So, yes, I do sometimes go back and use existing material if I think it's worth it.
Yeah,
so,
I think it's interesting what you were saying about the RNCM conference, because I'd say I know that world fairly well because I used to work at RNCM as an usher in the concert hall, so I got to watch a lot of a big variety of things, some new music, some old music. But I think sometimes there's the problem with a lot of modern classical music is that they're trying to stretch the boundaries of the mode so far that they forget about is there something people want to listen to.
There's nothing wrong with that. I believe in challenging people, but at the same time, I always thought if a composer wants to be appreciated, if he wants people to listen to his or her music, then surely you want to hear it more than once. It's no use sitting there saying, you know, oh, that wonderful cacophony, you know, so pleased with that piece, but no one wants to hear it again. And I sometimes feel that kind of music, although now I must say most composers are now turning to far more traditional, accessible means. It's being accepted, and of course it is.
I think it's just giving them an accessible sort of entry point to sort of get them in, get them familiar, and then you can maybe do the more challenging stuff.
Well, one example of this is someone I met some years ago who actually encouraged me to sort of start afresh, as it were, when I'd reached this point in my life in my 60s, and that was James Macmillan. He was in Manchester to attend a performance of his music, and I asked if I could meet up with him beforehand, and he gave me an hour of his time, and he just said, you know, well, he said, I know you're at that age. He said that most of the encouragement goes towards younger composers, and yes, I think that's important, but they mustn't forget there are still some of us oldies still have something to say. I still feel I have something to say, and he's encouraged me, and he actually helped me gain an award from the Paul Hamlin Foundation in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, when by that time I was self-employed as a lecturer going into schools on a completely different subject, and that award couldn't have come at a better time, because things were pretty bad, and with the success of that, I thought, well, why not? Let's give it another go, and that's led to my sort of present projects that I'm planning.
Yeah, oh, cool. No, that's all really interesting. So you mentioned about, I guess yourself and some other composers writing in some more broad styles. Just wondering if you could maybe talk us through your creative process, if you even have one sort of set process that you follow, or if you're more, I guess, guided by the instinct of what you're trying to write.
Well, let's take the ballet Pandora, Legend of Pandora, which I think is my most important orchestral work. So that started 2017. When they asked me to write a piece, Bolton, I had no idea. And first of all, I was going to write a set of variations, and then all of a sudden they said, from now on, we are going to theme our concerts. So this one is about myths and legends. They were doing Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade about the Arabian Nights, and then the Helios Overture by Carl Nielsen, which is all about the ancient Greek name for the sun, Helios. And then suddenly I went back to beginning of the millennium, when I'd left full-time teaching, did a bit of supply teaching, and a colleague of mine told me that she was the head of music at a school in Buxton, and she said year 8 students, 12-year-olds, are going to work on a project to do with the myth of Pandora. So we've got 3 levels. We've got music, we've got dance, we've got drama and poetry. Would you like to be involved? I suppose that was my first paid commission, because they applied for funds for that. And that was a great challenge. So for that, I composed music on 3 levels. We had a small ensemble that played live. I had a large group of percussion instruments, for which we did improvisations, planned in advance but improvised. And then the 3rd level was, at that time I'd just been introduced to Cubase system, so I composed some music using Cubase for the dance sequences. And then when the commission came from Bolton, I say commission, I didn't actually get paid for it, but anyway, I thought, myths and legends, let me go back to Pandora. I didn't use any of the material I'd used for Pandora, but I started afresh and started to look for it. Let's look at the life of Pandora, which isn't often discovered. We know about Pandora releasing all the evils into the world, but where was she born? How was she born? What did she do? What was she like? What did she feel like after she'd opened the box? How did she interact with all the other gods? Because she was a human made by the gods. So, in fact, somebody I sent a recording to recently, a professional musician, listened to the piece and said, there must be a program behind it, because it's very vivid. And I went to the program note, and she said, yeah, it all makes sense now. So I wrote a program, and when you start writing the music, this is another thing. At first, it's a blank canvas, and it all begins up here. And then it's translating what you can hear up here into notes. And I work without a piano. Well, I don't actually have a piano at home, or a keyboard. I prefer not to. I used to, not anymore. Because
so you use pencil and paper, or using Sibelius?
Sometimes I go straight onto the full score. That's something I learned from Malcolm Arnold. I know exactly what I want, so using, say, Sibelius software, I write a few melodic lines, and then look at it sort of in a linear way, and then open up the score and decide what will go with that. Add an accompaniment, a simple accompaniment, and then all the musical techniques come into play. Do I want counterpoint? Do I want another melody going against it? Do I want an ordinary accompaniment there? Do I want something less sort of root-based, something that's in the air? Do I want any other decoration? Do I want to add percussion? It just happens. It just flows. Luckily, it flows. And usually once I've started, in the case of Pandora, I wrote the first movement, and then I'd already had an idea for the second movement, and it's all to do with contrast. That talk I gave at Huddersfield before the concert, the conductor Ben was talking about Holst planets, that Holst was never comfortable with large canvases like symphonies.
Yeah.
He was much better at writing a suite. And so am I, although I have written, I mean, my concerto for bass clarinet is 20 minutes continuous music, but divided into 3 sections. But here I had a chance to be pictorial, and also my love for film music was a strong influence behind it as well. So, I mean, the influences are far and wide, but that's the trouble. People are always saying, oh, that sounds like Walton, that sounds like Respighi, that sounds like Holst. Yes, sounds like, but that's my conception. I don't go in saying, I'm going to make this sound like X or Y, Z or something. This is what I write. If it ends up sounding like that, a string quartet who first had a look at the second quartet that members of the Northern Film Orchestra eventually recorded, a different set of musicians said, you know, oh yeah, we can spot Shostakovich here, Walton here. I said, fine, I said, but I said the music's actually by Naftel, so that's my influences. There's nothing wrong in, there's nothing to be ashamed of. When I read critics' reviews of new recordings, and particularly of new music, they say, oh, you know, there's nothing new here. The harmony is wouldn't have been out of place at the end of the 19th century. What's wrong with that? Why not? I mean, composers from Mozart's day were all imitating each other. Every composer sounded like Mozart, or Mozart sounded like them. Beethoven owed a debt to Mozart and Haydn. Brahms never ventured further than what he'd learnt from the greats. So, but no one criticised Brahms for that. So,
no, I mean, I think it's kind of the hardest thing in any art form to try and be truly original. And I mean, even going back to those Greek myths, they're probably, you know what I mean, reconstructions of earlier myths and things like that. So, yeah, I don't think there's any problem with, taking those influences and having them in your music. Because I think subconsciously you tend to sort of absorb things from different places anyway. And then I always call it the memory bank. You have like a memory bank of little, like a bag of tricks you've got in your locker, and then you can think, oh, well, that thing I've done somewhere else, I could maybe use similar sort of strategy here.
You know, take one thing, I keep going on about it, but I'm genuinely proud of Pandora, that if you take that piece, there's probably several idioms in the music. I mean, one of the movements, the movement where she opens a vessel, you know, is probably the most modernistic of all, if you could call it that. You know, it's dissonant, it's bitonal, it's quite violent in places and mysterious at others. And then the movement for strings alone is, you know, almost like a bit of film music. I don't see what's wrong with that. I don't see why you should have multiple influences within one work. I mean, Messiaen's huge Tarantula symphony has some incredibly dissonant passages, but it has some great tunes as well.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with it, and I refuse to be, you know, to bow to criticism that there's nothing new here, it doesn't plumb the depth. Should we always plumb the depths? No. We should write what we want to write. If it's enjoyable for performers and listeners, great. We might be lucky to get a second or even third performance.
Yeah, I think that's part of the struggle as well. When you're writing large-scale orchestral music, just the difficulties in putting it on compared to, say, if you write like jazz music, very much in the jazz standards kind of style, it's easier to get a smaller ensemble together for that kind of stuff. But I think just because the economics and the nature of getting like 60, 70 people together for rehearsals and concerts, I think that's probably why it takes sometimes even decades for composers' pieces to start getting, you know, established, to have had enough time to become maybe beloved by the audiences and the performers themselves, which is probably an even bigger reason that they should programme more sort of modern works, I think. And I really enjoyed the programme from the Slaithwaite concerts, like combining the planets and then the Britain piece and then having yours. I think it's a really nice format of having the older pieces and then contrasted with something new. It's still all within the same kind of world of sound, if that makes sense.
they're one of the most unique amateur semi-professional orchestras. That they are really adventurous. They paired a Bruckner symphony with a piece by the conductor Esa-Pekka Salonen earlier, and they've done John Adams, which is incredibly difficult to perform, and good for them. Whereas other orchestras are more concerned with, you know, bums on seats and getting as many people as possible. Therefore, the music's, you know, it's got to be familiar.
Yeah, and it's like towing the line of the crowd pleasers. It gets people in the door, and then whilst also not maybe being too out there. I think that's part of the struggle of a lot of orchestras in this country. Is they're kind of towing that line, aren't they? Really?
Yeah.
You can have to be full, kind of embracing the new and the more adventurous stuff, and then maybe you sell less tickets, or you can be more of the crowd pleasers, and then maybe your program's not quite as dynamic and memorable. So it's a hard balance to get, I would say.
BBC Philharmonic's a case in point. They basically they can, because you know, being subsidised organisation, they can put on concerts, you know, mixing, you know, old and new, and good for them, I say. Halle sometimes do it as well, which is good, but everyone is looking to box office returns, so it's a shame that money overrides everything else, because also there seems to be certain I don't know how to put this without being too critical. It seems to be that there are certain composers these days who are heard almost every day on the radio or on BBC and programmed, and I'm wondering why they have the monopoly, because there are so many unknown or neglected pieces of music from way back that need to be performed as well. And it depends, I suppose, what kind of wokish mood everyone is in. What should we promote this week? And we mustn't forget to do this. It doesn't really matter. A composer shouldn't be judged by their, you know, gender, by their background, by their creed, by their faith. It should be music that is good, well written, enjoyable to listen to, enjoyable to play, practical, and perhaps has a point to make in that it's a piece of music that should be better known. Yeah,
of course. So I just wanted to kind of circle back to the concert talk. There were some interesting things you said there about you were talking about, you set yourself a little challenge of writing some Australian landscape pieces and things like that, and I thought that was quite interesting. Just wondering if you could elaborate on that, and then maybe talk about, because you mentioned how they can be like great little exercises for composers to kind of develop their craft. Just if you could give us some more detail about that, because I'm sure there's a lot of composers in our audience who would love to sort of set their own little exercises and things.
Well, that was through my association, through my publishers. Sometimes they will recommend, or they'll send you a message saying that certain artists are looking for collaborations with composers, and I was lucky to make the acquaintance of a young American pianist who lives in France, Hayley Miles, who positively encourages new music, and after discussion with her, I decided to write a set of 5 short pieces, aphoristic impressions I call them, in which I wanted to say as much as possible within 2 minutes, even less in some cases. This is another thing as well, and I think other composers will probably agree with me here, and I'm not mentioning any names, but there are some artists who are far too precious for their own good. They don't like to be contacted out of the blue. They are too busy to take on anything else, and then there are people like Hayley and a few others who are just grateful that other people want to write for them. So I owe Hayley a lot, and she's a superb musician as well. So I thought, right, this is going to be the start of a set of short piano pieces. This will be set 1, and it was influenced by landscapes. And in each one, I create a musical impression of a landscape that maybe I myself don't know, or certainly in some cases I've been nowhere near them. But you know, in the 19th and 20th century, composers such as Debussy were writing pieces about Spain when they'd never even been to Spain. You know, Chabrier wrote España, having never been to Spain, and he captured the mood. So it was that sort of thing, but in miniature. What could I say? Could I make it pianistic? Could I make it virtuose without being over the top? So I gathered together a number of landscapes, some of which I'd visited. So there's the famous town of Dunwich in Suffolk, which disappeared. You know, it was eroded by the sea, and there's a legend that says one of the churches under the sea rings its bells on dark nights. You can hear it. So I created that in sound, and then there was another one, which was the eruption of a geyser in Iceland. So I called that Mini Magma, which again is a play on words, Mini Magnum. And that was the shortest eruption, you know, ever, but somehow it worked. And the Australian connection comes in the third one, which I called, another pun, Rue Awakening, instead of Rude Awakening. And in that piece, which lasts barely a minute and a half, I conjured up avian sounds, jumping kangaroos, bounding, leaping kangaroos, the awe and majesty of Uluru, Ayers Rock, and one or two other indigenous creatures. And somehow this all gelled. So that's my prayer. And it was from that I thought I would love to write, thinking again of the pianist Hayley, I'd like to write a piano concerto at some stage, possibly influenced by Ayers Rock. And she put me in touch with an Australian musician who works quite exclusively with you know, ethnic indigenous people in Australia as well. And I told him my idea, and he came back and said, on no account must I tackle anything to do with Uluru, because I could put my very life in danger. At first I thought he was joking, but he was deadly serious, and he said it could have tragic repercussions.
So it's like a sacred part of their culture.
Yeah,
it's
I
like
mean,
untouched, mustn't be touched, kind of.
I know, but
anyway.
people have assimilated Arabic melodic lines and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox chant in the music, and it's not in any way it's not detrimental, and it's certainly not in a way making fun of or mocking at. I tried to explain it's an impression, and it probably won't be called anything to do with Ayers Rock and Roll. It might be, you know, fantasy on world themes or whatever. But rather than put me off, and in the end he did apologise for, you know, for his sort of outburst as it was. He said, you know, I've had an experience, and I thought to myself, well, maybe he didn't do it right. He said you should ask permission. Well, no, I don't need to ask permission. I don't need to ask permission if I'm going to do an impression of, you know, an Arabic dance, or use a Hebraic melody that's used in sacred services. You know, because why not? I think it's a tribute in a way.
Yeah. So I guess you're trying to like embody the spirit of the place.
Well, that's all we're doing. We're not writing authentic Aboriginal music, and dare do that at all. And then I think after that, the Australian, there's an impression of a Japanese garden in which I used a Japanese melodic scale and quoted part of a famous Japanese song. And the last movement is an impression of the rapids, the Whirlpool Rapids. Anyway.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you think those are good little exercises for composers to kind of learn and to hone their craft.
Little miniatures. So Hayley was delighted with them, and they appear on my album that was released last October on Divine Art. And I'm writing a second set for her, a sonata, and also I'm arranging one of my string pieces for two pianos, because my husband's a pianist as well, and they'll do a two piano version of it, possibly another piece as well. So I've got an artist there who thankfully, is very interested in receiving new music, and that's what a composer needs, because you know, if an artist wants to play new music, if new music isn't being written, they won't be able to do it. If they're keen, then I think we should do all we can to encourage them.
Yeah,
As I say, some artists are not like that. They're very sort of guarded.
yeah, become a bit
Probably
more,
good reasons for it as
bit
well.
more fixed in what they're doing. Cool. So just a couple of more talking points I wanted to address. You mentioned before about the always start and end strongly, but I just wondered if there was any other key pieces of advice or maybe mentors that you'd had on your journey so far. Maybe things that helped shape you more in the early days as you were still developing.
Well, apart from the person who told me to begin a piece and grab everyone's attention, which I always try to do, the other thing was write whatever you want. Write what you want to write, and let it all come out naturally, and don't be afraid of influences, which I tell to all my composition students. And anyone who's interested in composition, I think in other interviews I've given, I've just said, be whoever you want to be, and it doesn't matter what style you write in. If you're comfortable with that, then make the most of it.
Yeah.
I would say be disciplined. Make sure what you're doing. I think there's a need for a composer to be concise.
Yeah, not to sort of go on and on and on.
Particularly today, when we're all sort of, you know, we're worried about financial situations. I think the shorter a piece, the better a chance it's got of being performed.
Yeah.
All of the ensemble. Certainly, if you know musicians, you've got a ready-made, you know, group there. And in the case of the projects that lie ahead for this year, you know, a lot of them are geared towards smaller groups.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've just gone my own way. I think I was
figured it out as you go, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I was looking in 1983. I was only 26 then. That in those days, having your music played on the BBC, broadcast on Radio 3, was so different from today. It was easier in a way. You just submitted as many scores as you want to a reading panel. And I remember I did this while I was in my last year at university, and one of the composer lecturers there said to me, he said, just send whatever you want. He said, they'll send it back, say thank you, don't let that put you off. And I sent them 10 scores, and they actually came back and said, we'd like to do this piece, and we're putting you in touch with the BBC Philharmonic producer. I went to see him, and he said, right, he said, I'm going to put the proposal to Edward Downes. The late Edward Downes was the principal conductor. He has first refusal. And I waited 6 months later. He said, yep, Edward Downes has agreed to do it. Blah, blah, blah. This is the date of the performance. It will be recorded. That's, you know, for a 26-year-old, that's wonderful. And I met 2 other composers that day. They were all premieres, all British composers. Funny enough, we were all Jewish composers as well, although the music had no connection to whether that was just by chance, doesn't really matter. But the other composers were older, more established, Malcolm Lipkin and Brian Elias, fascinating people, and their music was so different, vastly different from mine. So there were 3 different styles of British music going on, and it was just great to hear that piece. And I've actually been trying to... someone reviewing my new album in the Gramophone magazine a month ago referred to the piece, the Concerto for Orchestra, that was premiered that night, and he said it's a great pity that wasn't included on the album. So myself and Divine Art, so a recording company, we contacted them and asked them if it was possible to license it. Which turned out I'd need a five-figure sum to get it licensed, even though most of the players, I'm afraid, are either retired or not alive anymore. So that's why I'm going to get that piece re-recorded, hopefully by Slaithwaite, and it will give me a chance to rewrite it, because it's still in manuscript. I've not transcribed it.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. No, that all sounds really great. Just wrapping this up then, I wondered if you had any sort of closing advice for young composers, maybe who are starting out or just maybe leaving A levels, going on to the university studies? Just anything that you think is useful.
Well,
for them.
from my own experience, for GCSE, I think the first year I taught GCSE music, and I was lucky enough to have a really good class of musicians there, the number of 12-bar blues I counted.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So eventually I said, stop writing 12-bar blues. Everyone writes them, and there are so many, you know, you won't be judged fairly on that. Write something different, and write something that perhaps you find challenging, because the more effort you put into it, the more the examiner will see, and also you'll make a personal statement with it as well. Try to write something that isn't usually your remit, just for this exercise, and if you're not happy with it, fine, but give it a try. For A level, and the other thing was, even though teaching GCSE music was a very strange thing when it first started. Really, there's no set works, there's no set plan, as it were. There is a general scheme of work, and basically you introduce the students to as much music as possible in all idioms. And I had a private pupil who was doing, had to do the composition part, and she'd written a piano piece because she was a pianist. She was also a flautist, and I said, well, your piano piece is very traditional, but well written. I said, do you know anything about serial music, 12-note music? She said, no. I said, right, let's have a crash course. And she ended up, with my guidance, I told her a set of variations for flute and piano on a 12-note theme, and I showed her how to do it, how to create the different versions, the retrograde inversion, all that stuff. I said, but the writing of it is you. What I said, all I'll say is make the first variation slow, the next fast, alternate slow and fast, and end up with, with a brilliant finale. And just left it to her. I don't think I needed to correct much. So that's one thing. For A-level students, you really have to think outside the box. And particularly if you're working with software, most schools have it anyway. If you're working with something like Sibelius, in fact I recommend you work with Sibelius or equivalent, start writing for orchestra and start to hear the sounds that it makes. Experiment. You've got plenty of time to do this, and then once you've written it, in whatever format it's in, anything else, any sort of odd bits can be ironed out. But I always try not to correct too much. I want it to be a little raw in places, because I want it to come naturally. When it comes to university, depending on which university and who your tutors are, depending on the composer tutor, it depends. Some of them may be happy for you to write in whatever style possible. Others may limit you to certain things. I don't want to say ignore them, but I would say go your own way. It's very difficult. Composition's a very personal thing, and I could teach someone to compose like me, but what's the point? All we get is someone, who's a Naftel imitator. I think it's what Ravel said to Gershwin when Gershwin met him in Paris and said, I'd like to have some lessons from you. And Ravel said, why do you want to be a second-rate Ravel when you're already a first-rate Gershwin? So exactly, that's my thought.
Yeah, so just go your own way and follow
your own way.
Follow your own instincts, whilst also, take
something personal into it. Remember that composers of the past, they sweated blood, to get their music performed. They suffered ill health because of it. Don't do that, for heaven's sake. But do take your time, and doesn't matter if you spend a couple of hours on something, then leave it and go back to it a few days. Sometimes going back to what you've written a few days later makes you think afresh, and you may be able to continue. Or I'm lucky, I've always had this ability to, even if I leave a piece for a week, to come back and continue exactly, from where I've left off.
Yeah.
Some people that's hard. Sometimes you can. In the old days, I used to just look at it, and if I'd written it down, screw it up, start again. At least with Sibelius, you've got the framework there, you've got the template, use it.
Yeah, and you can just press save as and make like a duplicate, and then
Exactly,
mess around as much as you want. You don't lose the old version.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think we're probably fortunate with a lot of technology that maybe allows, makes that side of things easier. But no, I think that's great advice. Really, I'm sure that would be useful for people listening in. But yeah, as you say, I think composers, especially in film music, they are too often trying to imitate without putting enough of their own individuality into it. And I think it's hard as well when you're sort of writing show reels or like your portfolio pieces. You want it to kind of have that wow factor.
I think,
and a lot of times it's hard to have the wow factor and the individuality.
I think the problem, you mentioned film music, and I've always admired, I've been a great lover of film music. I can honestly say I don't think there's anyone writing today who is worthy of the greats, except perhaps John Williams.
What about Howard Shore with Lord of the Rings?
Howard Shore, yes, and also, mind you, he unfortunately passed away, died in an accident. James Horner was a British Alan Silvestri. But we're looking back at films from the 90s onwards. Today, a lot of music seems to be just rhythm and bass. But if you take action movies, you won't get memorable themes. And I think the thing is now is that it's more about creating an atmosphere rather than creating something memorable. And I know that film music should always be in the background, but it should also add something to a scene. And I suppose it's a difficult task because some of the films being made today, are not the kind of movies that perhaps to which music comes easily.
Yeah.
We've not got any epics really being made these days. We've not got, very sort of lengthy love stories in which, composers can pile it on thick. Besides which, I think it'd become anachronistic if we had rather romantic music. I don't think the opportunities are there. I think John Williams is the last great composer of the Hollywood era, but I would also rate composers like Jerry Goldsmith, who's probably just imaginative. I mean, he created a new sound for Planet of the Apes, the 1968 version, and for Alien. Composers have often imitated that style. And also, there's a young composer who I've heard him in his music for a number of films. He's actually from a musical dynasty, Benjamin Valfish. He's the son of Raphael, the grandson of Anita Lasker Valfish, who survived Auschwitz. And he's written for a couple of horror movies. Very, very well written music. So yes, there are a few. I just don't think there are suitable enough films for music to achieve its greatest power. I mean, if you take Oppenheimer with a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, I think Christopher Nolan, the director, wanted the music literally to overwhelm the film, and that's why a lot of the dialogue is unintelligible. And that was deliberate. He just wanted the music to swamp the listener in a melee of noise.
Yeah.
And that's using music, I think, in the wrong way. But hey, that's just my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, great stuff. Well, I think we can probably wrap it up there. But I'm sure there's loads of useful little bits and bobs within that chat for our young composers listening. But I just wanted to thank you for being our debut guest on these composer interviews. So best of luck for the year ahead. I'm sure we'll be seeing much more from you to come. And then, guys, we'll include a link down in the description with a link to some of Freddy's past works. I think your stuff's on Spotify, and then you've got the Divine Arts website as well.
Yes.
And then have you got your own personal website with some examples?
There's quite a lot of stuff on my own site.
So we'll put all the links below, and then if you're interested in discovering more of Freddy's work, you can just find it there.